Philo Hickok purchases the majority of his land from Peter Schofield in 1855. In 1871 he sells part of the property to Robert Beckett, and remarks same also reserving 2 feet off northwest side from house to stable. The house was built between 1855 and 1871 by Philo Hickok. This home was built for Philo Hickok and his family in order that he might reside close to his foundry, historically located in the rear of the property boundaries. The land records indicate that the land on which this house resides was given to Abel Stevens Jr. by his father. A few years later, he sold the property to John Weatherhead. By 1850, the lot is bought by Walter Dinnup. He built a tenement home on this property. The home was used by Walter Dinnup as tenant apartments. Many of his employees, who worked out of a mansion. Walter Dinnup, owner and operator of the Delta Mill. Israel Stevens sold the land to Daniel Davison for $100 on August 1879, who sold it to the trustees of the Regular Baptist Church for $1,500 on October 22, 1953. The home was erected between 1879 and 1897 by Daniel Davison. This home is interesting to the community of Delta as an example of the type of home that would have been provided for the Methodist minister by the congregation. Walter Bursch sold this property to Israel Stevens for $500 on May 10, 1889. Israel Stevens sold the property to the trustees of the Delta Baptist Church on April 10, 1889 for $125. It was likely built before the date that the trustees actually took it over, perhaps 1879. This building has housed the Delta Baptist community for well over 100 years and is the perfect example of small country church. Florence Pratt bought the property for $6,000 from Edna Monkton. Monkton had purchased the property in 1952 from Estella Willis for $1,000. Willis had inherited the land for $1 from Momer Russell. Russell had bought the land from Cordelia Powell for $485. Powell purchased the land from Nathaniel Wetherill for $700. Wetherill had purchased the land from the Methodist Church for $350 in 1889. The church bought the land in 1863 from Walterton UAB for $60. Teeth Church was built around 1863 as a Methodist church. August 1870, Walter Dinnup sells property to Israel Stevens for $100. Israel Stevens sells to Effie Gilbert $1 in 1920. Gilbert sells land to Donald McIntyre for $1 the same year. Donald McIntyre sells lot to Clinton Bogart for $2,600 in 1922. Israel Stevens built this home between 1870 and 1897. In 1888, Jane Dunham sells the lot to Alexander Sherwood for $200. In 1889, the lot is sold from Alexander Sherwood to James Flynn for $250. In 1890, James Flynn sells the property to Julia Flynn for $1. In 1903, Julia sells the lot to William Flynn for $500. In 1911, William Flynn sells the lot for $775. In 1949, Omer S. Russell sells the property to Lloyd and Norma Irwin for $1,500. In 1954, Lloyd and Norma Irwin sell the property to Kathleen and Donald Reddy for $2,500. In 1967, Donald and Kathleen Reddy sell the home for $6,500 to Joyce and Kenneth Gray. A large steeple was once on this church, but disrepair and the cost of maintenance caused the church to remove it, post-1975. The church displays that as Delta businesses grew and flourished, so too did its community. The Methodists who once had to share a building with the Anglicans and Baptists progressed to a point where they were able to erect their own place of worship, which they outgrew and subsequently built this church, today United Church. Walter Dinnup sells the lot to James Ackland for £15 in 1885. Ackland sells the same property in September of 1885, for $2,100. This would indicate that between February of 1885 and September of 1885, there was a structure built on this lot. In 1861, Walter Dinnup sells the property to William Johnson for $500. In 1865, William Johnson sells the property to Richard Johnson for $100. In 1868, George Johnson buys the property from James Hazelton for $529. In February of 1871, James Hazelton sells the property to Elizabeth Beatty for $1,000. In 1884, Elizabeth J. Beatty sells the property for $1,200 to William Russell. The Old Stone Mill is a 3.5-story rectangular stone structure with classical proportions and a long facade, located on Main Street in the village of Delta. Currently owned and operated by the Delta Mill Society, which has conducted a number of restoration projects and sponsored a series of public exhibitions. A landmark for pioneer architecture, the Old Stone Mill is a fine example of an early Georgian industrial architectural style and is reputed to be the second oldest building of its type in Ontario. Aside from the mill, this building, with its series of storefronts, was the basis of the Delta economy for many years. The original building on this location was 3 stories high, but burnt down. The Jubilee Building gets its title as the business block was rebuilt in honor of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. William Bell purchases lot from Donald MacDonald on June 4, 1861. The house was built between 1861 and 1863 by William Bell. Land purchased in 1861 when Bell was 48. In 1863 he paid $200 tax on this lot. On March 2, 1905, William Bell gave this property to his grandson. This home belonged to a prominent local figure and businessman. It is indicative of the prosperity of Delta during the 1800s to early mid-1900s, and actively displays Georgian-style architecture and detail. William Bell bought the property from William Webster for £35 in 1865. In 1869, William Bell sells that same lot for $500 to Horace Stevens for $500. This indicates that William Bell would have built his store sometime in the years of 1865 to 1869. This home was the childhood home of Lorne Pierce, one of the most famous names in Canadian literature. The property first shows itself on land records in 1888, when Richard Venus and his wife sell the property to Daniel Davidson for $450. The property does not sell again until Daniel Davidson's estate trustees sell the property to Edward Pierce for $4,200. Edward Pierce was the father of the famous Lorne Pierce. Story: according to the current owners, Dan Davidson built this house as his own personal residence. Upon completion of this home, his wife had died. Heartbroken over her death, he never lived in the home. The home was then eventually sold to the Lorne Pierce family, who owned the home from 1911-1920s. Eventually the home would be bought by Hydro. This was once the home of the village blacksmiths. His shop was located in an outbuilding to the back of the home. In 1837, James MacDonald sells the land to George Connors for £20. It is sold to Thomas Fry for $675 in 1919. The home was purchased by Kevin Birch in 1999, from Gail and Gordon Birch for $53,000. They had inherited the property from Lenore Raison for $1. Lenore and her husband had bought the property from John Burns in 1956 for $3,750. Burns had purchased the land from Clifford Ralph for $3,000 in 1927. Ralph had bought the land for $1,200 in 1919 from Rosalind Wood. Wood had purchased the land from Edward Lying for $600 in 1885. Lying had purchased the land from Levi Soper in 1885 for $150. This would indicate that the home was built in or around 1885. Widow Eleanor Morris sells land to Joel Copeland on September 14, 1886 for $250. Joel Copeland sells the property for $3,000 to Caroline J. Dina on February 3, 1894. Structure built between 1886 and 1894 by Joel Copeland. Home of the legendary local character Dr. Kelly, who is often remarked to have cured more illnesses with his good humor than his medicine. He is famous in the area for a hoax which took place just after the Diane quintuplets were born. After delivering the 5th girl to a family who had previously had 4 girls, he went into the Delta business block and remarked that he had just given birth to the 5th girl. In 1885, The lot was sold by Eleanor Morris to Edward Link for $130. This lot had a 60-foot frontage. Edward Link then sells the lot to Phineas Jackson for $1,050 in 1887. This would indicate that a house was built on this lot between 1885 to 1887. The lot was sold in two halves. Eleanor Morris sold the lot to Joel Copeland for $250 in 1886. In 1894, Joel Copeland sells the other half of this property to Carolyn Nutt for $3,000. This lot had 88 feet of frontage. The home was erected between 1902 and 1933 by Elmer Brown. This elegant home is an example of architectural prowess and ingenuity. Initially the residence belonged to the Brown couple, beloved by their community. Elmer Brown was a warden of Leeds and Grenville in 1902 and a prosperous businessman. He was integral in the construction of the Jubilee Building in the Delta Business Block after the original structure was destroyed by fire. His wife, known as Lizzie, was known throughout the village, keeping a millinery shop and providing art classes for Delta residents. Casper Mattis sold the original lot to William Bates for £50 in 1850. In 1867, William Bates sells the lot to George Tompkins for $600. This price increase could indicate that the house was built between 1850 and 1867. Home of Alexander Stevens. He owned the carriage factory in Delta. This home was built by Alexander Stevens, the great-grandson of Abel Stevens, on land that was originally granted by the Crown. Once it was built, it remained in the Stevens family for approximately 100 years. This home has a combination of Italianate and Georgian style of architecture. This home belonged to the great-grandson of Abel Stevens, the original founder of Delta. The land first shows up on land records in 1913. In 1913, Eusebi Kendrick sells the property to Nancy Husman and Henrietta Mogrigan for $3,900. In 1918, the southern one-half of the property is sold to James Husman, who buys it from Henrietta Mogrigan for $375. James Husman then sells the property in September of 1919 to Edward Suffel for $1,500. At the time of construction in 1811, the church served Baptist congregation in Delta. Meanwhile, the Anglican Church appointed a missionary to serve the needs of the areas that did not yet have a church to use. In 1827, the Baptist Church was purchased by the Anglican Church. Until 1864, both the Baptist and Anglican congregations shared the church and used it as a place of worship. Between 1843 and 1862 the Methodist congregation also used the church as a place of worship. In 1864, the Baptist congregation sold their shares in the church to the Anglican congregation and named it St. Paul's Anglican Church. The church's history of shared use between multiple congregations tells the story of Delta's early religious history. It has been in continuous use for over 195 years. According to the land records, in 1924 John H. Wood sold the house to Adelbert Campbell for $1,000. There are no land records on this particular lot prior to this date. According to the 1897 fire insurance map, there was a wooden building located on this lot during this time. This home was part of the Anglican Church lot. The original lot was bought by the church from Nicholas Mattis for £100. The church sectioned off a piece of the lot in 1926 to Henry McElroy. The house is later inherited by his son. According to the 1897 fire insurance map, there was a brick building located on this lot. This property was purchased by Charlotte Singleton from Rufus Stevens in 1892 for $300. She sold this land to Walter Visser the next year for $1,300. The house was built between 1892 and 1893. This home is located on the outskirts of Delta nearby to where the tannery was once located. The land on which this building sits on was bought in 1871 by the Morrises. They leased it to the Agricultural Society of South Leeds. The Agricultural Society bought the land outright in 1911. In 1866, the first fair took place at the Delta Fairgrounds. The 158th annual fair took place in 1980. The Delta Fairgrounds remain one of the longest-run county fairs throughout Ontario. There is a wooden structure on this lot, according to the 1897 fire insurance map. This building contributes to the historical value of the village. Its simple rectangular, symmetrical form relates to other buildings in the village and the surrounding areas. Ralph Ball purchased the property for $50,000 in 1993, from Vivian Morris. Morris had inherited the land from William Morris for $1 in 1996. The Morris bought the property from Alphonse Cataliner for $6,800 in May of 1967. The Cataliners had purchased the land from Gladys Potter in 1960, for $2,300. Potter had inherited the land from James Mott for $1. Mott was the executor of James Belt's will. Belt had bought the property in 1865, for $500 from James Cares. Stephen Bottom had purchased the home from Lorna Mae Henderson in 2000 for $77,000. Lorna had purchased the home in July of 1973 for $12,000 from Irene Bullisell. Harry had purchased the land in July of 1945 for $1,000 from Charles Edwin Lewis. Lewis had inherited the land for $1 from George Lewis in 1936. George Lewis had purchased the land for $200 in 1914 from George Morris. Gerald and William Phillips bought the home and land from the estate of Mary Lorraine Halliday in 1996. In 1983, the Mary Lou Morris inherits the same land in the estate of Margaret and Morris for $1. In 1946, Stanley Morris bought the land from William Birch, for $1. William Birch bought the original lot for $450, from Phineas Jackson in 1926. This would indicate that the home was built between 1926 to 1946. This home was built by William Birch. Many of the brick homes built on William Street were built by Birch. He was famous for his bricklaying abilities. Anson Coleman sells the lot to George Stevens for $190, in 1890. In 1901, Delilah Stevens inherits the lot for $1. In 1910, Delilah sells the land for $1,200 to Robert Stevens. This would indicate that the home was built between 1890 to 1910. There is a wooden building located on this lot, according to the 1897 fire insurance map. There is no brick building on this lot, according to the 1897 fire insurance map. This home is related to other buildings within the village visually and contributes to the historical character of the village. In March of 1880, the lot is bought by George Connors from Anson Coleman for $200. It is sold to Elizabeth Connors for $800. In 1936 is sold to Harry Morris for $750. This home would stay in the Morris family until 1993, when it is sold to the current owner Douglas Burrows. On the 1897 fire insurance map, there is a wooden building on a lot. This particular home was built by William Birch for William and Lillian Sheridan as a retirement home. Then they decided to move from the family farm and enjoy what was left of their retirement years. There are no brick buildings located on this lot, according to the 1897 fire insurance map. This school was once used as the Delta Schoolhouse. This school was constructed in 1876. The land was purchased to build the school on, from Walter Dinah for £250. This could indicate that a structure was already on this piece of land. The school was in 1969 to the Royal Canadian Legion. Today the school is used as the Delta Legion Hall. This home is located near the corner of King and William. There are many other brick homes located in this section of Delta which are indicative of the prosperity of the brickyard and the proximity of these homes to the original brickyard location. Rectangular plan, 2 stories, high hip roof, asphalt shingles, 1/1 windows, brick voussoirs above the windows. Front door is offset to the right. A small porch is located on the right side of the front facade. It has 3 small pillars across the front with lattice work along the lower half. Brick portion of the home is entirely symmetrical. The land was purchased in 1878 by William Bell for $209 from John Hazelton. William Bell sold the land in 1886 for $400 to a Thomas Van Assenham sold it for $550 to William Singleton. Singleton then sold the property for $2,000 to Edward Pierce. These transactions were all made on the same day in August. This would indicate that the property was not registered until August 31 RSD, 1886. This could indicate that the home was built between 1882 and 1886. William Bell originally built the home. The land was first bought from Walter Dinah in 1877, by the trustees of the Methodist Church of Delta. I.L. Sharon Dixie purchased the home from the church in 1990. The home was built by the church in 1900. It was used to house parishioners of the church. The home was used as the church manse for the United Church of Delta for over 30 clergy. Many people remember being married in this house. This building contributes to the historical character of the village. It was built during a time in which brick was readily available to the residents of Delta. It was also built during a time of prosperity in the village. Used as a family home for the Dinah family. The Dinahs were a very prominent family in Delta, and hosted many dinner parties with important government officials, including Sir John A. Macdonald and Charles Tupper. Walter Dinah was the owner and operator of the Delta Mill. In the late 1900s the servants' quarters of the mansion was used as a dairy. In 1939, the attic of the home caught on fire. Today the beams of the mansion are still black, from the fire. According to the Land Records Office, the land was purchased by Walter Dinah from Caspar Mattis, in 1843, for £500. The land would be transferred into Caroline Dinah's names in 1889. She would sell the land in 1894, to a Joel Copeland for $5,000. The home was built in 1849, by Walter Dinah. William Birch was the original builder of this home. At one time this home was used as an office for the Power Authority. It was built between 1941 and 1920. Throughout the home, the windows are double-hung. At the top of each window are radiating voussoirs. The home has 3 verandas. On the second floor of the home, there are 2. There are also 2 patios on the first floor of the house. On the left-hand side of the home, there is a side entrance, with an arched doorway. On the second floor of the home, there is a small semicircular window, with a crucifix design over the top. The brick on each corner of the home has a decorated pattern, and different colored brick is used. Robert Birch purchased this land from Charles Rogers in 1866 for £60. Robert Birch died and the executor of his estate, William Birch, sold this property on March 1908 for $800 to Elizabeth Hartley. The house was built between 1866 and 1908 by Robert Birch. Current owner said 1868. John Brown sold his land to William Johnson in 1890 for $200. Johnson sold it to William Pierce in 1901 for $700. Home built between 1890 and 1897 by William Johnson. His brother built the identical home next door. Aside from the neighboring home there are few heritage homes in this section of Delta that are clapboard, suggestive of the year this house was built, the materials that were available, and how early this section was settled. John Brown sold the land to Herman Johnson for $100 in 1889. Johnson and wife sold this lot to Robert Green in 1901 for $675. The house was built between 1889 and 1897 by Herman Johnson. His brother also built the house next door. This building was once used as the town courthouse, community center and Mason's Lodge. It was once a huge part of community life in Delta.